So I'll call the meeting to order. Welcome everybody here from our long absence, and hope everybody has done well with COVID. First item is the approval of the agenda, and we need to amend the agenda by striking item 3 or amending item 3 to be amending the meeting schedule instead of call for a special meeting. So that's the only change that I know of, in case, unless somebody else has something. Is there a motion?
Make a motion to move the adopted meeting schedule for the Board of Commissioners as recommended by staff.
And I need you to adopt the agenda as amended.
Okay. Make a motion we adopt the agenda as amended.
Got it. Okay.
Second.
Motion made and second. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, we're into pre-budget review. Joe?
All right, thank you, Mayor and members of the board. Welcome back. We're in a little bit different setting than we're used to. Tonight's meeting is meant to give you a preview or a toolkit, so to speak, of items and information that will help you when the budget is presented to you on May 20th. The other reason for meeting tonight is because of the restrictions on the size of the meetings that we can have and the social distance that we're allowed to have with each other. We're doing a test run, and since that prevents us from having the public actually sit in the meeting, we're trying to live stream. And already we've had one hiccup, so this is one thing that we're just working through. So this meeting is also to help reveal what our technical limitations are in live streaming. So with that, we'll go ahead and get underway. The outline and purpose of tonight's meeting is to give you an overview of the budget process and schedule, specifically describe the steps leading to the adoption of the budget ordinance, give you more detail on the general funds fund balance, what it is, how it's used, and how much you need. Talk about property value and property tax, the cause and effect of tax rate changes, and I underline changes because there is a cause and effect when you increase taxes, but there's also a cause and effect when you decrease, or in some cases, as you'll see in this presentation, when you keep the tax rate the same. This is a revaluation year, so we need to give you what's called a revenue neutral tax rate, so I thought it was only appropriate to let you know what that is and how it's calculated. And then particularly with the COVID-19 event, to give you some insight on some revenue projections that will affect the budget that we present to you next week. As far as the budget process and schedule, your budget message will be delivered to you on May 20th. I've placed in quotes these bullet points because they're pulled directly from the general statutes. So as the budget officer, the town manager, it's my statutory responsibility to provide you a concise explanation of the governmental goals, to explain the important features of the budgeted activities, and provide explanation of changes from the previous year as far as goals, programs, and appropriations. We'll also deliver to you any changes, recommended changes in fiscal policy, whether they be standard operating procedures that staff follows or policies that the town board adopts. And once again, as this is a revaluation year that the county has kicked off, we have to provide you a statement of revenue neutral property tax rate. Continuing on with the schedule, you'll have 2 work sessions. You'll have one on June 10th, another on June 17th. You'll have a budget public hearing June 22nd. At the conclusion of the budget public hearing, you'll be in a position to adopt a budget ordinance if you so choose. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you do have to adopt a budget before the end of June. You can adopt the budget ordinance that's recommended to you by staff, or you can modify it. So that's the budget process and schedule. Let's move into general fund balance. Again, what is it, how is it used, and how much do you need? So the general funds fund balance, what it is, it's your savings account. How is it used? We use it for emergencies. So this month, last year, we had a tornado touch down in Zebulon. It hit some unincorporated parts of the county. But when you took a look at the damage that was caused in both Zebulon as well as in the county, it didn't meet the thresholds for FEMA reimbursement. And so that was an excellent example of how to use general fund balance to pay for things like overtime and cleanup and the things that we did as a result of that tornado coming through town. You can also use it for investment. So as an example, you've got a facade grant policy, you've got a streetscape match policy, you can have other incentive policies. This is a way to set up those grants or those loan programs to incentivize development to come into your town that in turn improve properties, and as a result increase property values, and as a result increase property tax revenue. So there's some things to consider if you want to pay things forward, so to speak. Another use for general fund balance is for those capital purchases. And so when I'm talking about capital purchases, I'm not talking about things like vehicles for patrol officers. Patrol officers, when you fund a patrol officer, you're not only paying the salary and the benefits, but you're paying for the equipment like the armor and the protection as well as the vehicle. They go through those vehicles about every 4 or 5 years. At about 5 years, they're completely worn out. Those are expenses that we roll into operational expenses. So when I'm talking about capital purchases, I'm not talking about those types of vehicles. Nor am I talking about the very expensive pieces of equipment that last 15 to 30 years, like your fire pumpers or your fire ladder trucks. I'm talking about those in-between pieces of equipment that last longer than 5 years, but not as long as 15 years. They're usually equipment that Public Works uses. You can also use them for big-ticket items that you may not want to finance. An example could be the purchase of property for a fire station. So those are 3 examples of how to use general fund balance. Where I'm going to spend the majority of time tonight is talking to you about how to use it for managing cash flow, and how to use it to get the best bond rating, which is the best interest rate for when you borrow money. When I'm talking about managing cash flow, as an example, if you look at a community that's a tourism-based community, they get a big slug of money during the summer, and then the next big slug of money that they get is when they collect property taxes at the end of the calendar year. So there's 3 to 4 months between the end of summer and December. There's 3 to 4 months between the end of January and the beginning of summer, where they don't have enough cash on hand to pay their expenses. So for those communities that are tourism-based communities, that's how they use general fund balance to manage cash flow. You have a different economy that I'm going to explain tonight. And bond rating is if you have a certain amount of fund balance on hand, then you can get credit that goes towards a good bond rating. It's not the only criteria, but it's one component of that bond rating criteria. So how much you need? Well, it depends upon what your tax base is, what your economy is, and at the end of the day, as much data as I bring to you, and as you've come to find out or will find out, I will speak truth to this board, but at the end of the day, you all are the ones making the decision. And at the end of the day, that's going to rest a lot upon what your tolerance or your aversion to risk is. And so that's one of the reasons we went through that risk compass exercise at your retreat in February. So more specifically, what is your fund balance or your savings account? You take a look at that column on the left, that is the total fund balance. The fund balance is a component of different categories of funds. So the bottom part of that bar graph is what's called restricted funds. These are funds that are collected for a specific purpose that can only be used for those specific purposes. Typically, they're collected by the state and they're given to you. One example is you can get law enforcement funds. You can also get what's called POW bill funds. POW bill funds are gas tax. When you receive gas tax money, it has to go to streets. So those are examples of restricted funds that you have in savings. You can only use it for that. You can't change it for any other reason. The next category is committed funds. Committed funds are similar to restricted, but you have control over that. So I'll give you an example. If you have a project that's a street and thoroughfare capital project, and that project comes in under budget and you have some savings, we have reserve accounts associated with each capital project. And so those savings roll into the capital reserves for the streets and thoroughfare capital budget. Those funds are committed. They can only be used for streets and thoroughfares unless you as a board pull them out and assign them somewhere else. So they're committed to a particular fund unless you all decide differently. The assigned, what that represents, that category is projects that you have already identified that are going to get general fund balance money in the year to come. So that's assigned, but you can change that designation. You can choose not to move forward with the project before you get underway. You can choose to delay the project. You can choose to kill the project. And when you do that, that frees those funds up. The last and the biggest pot of money is the unassigned. These are savings that are not restricted, they're not committed, they're not assigned, they are free to be used however you wish. So that leaves the unrestricted amount that's available for your use. And right now, you've got about $8.4 million of unrestricted general fund balance. Something to note, the only time of year that we know what the general fund balance is the end of the fiscal year. So these values that I'm giving to you, they represent June 30th of 2019. The only time you're made aware of that is when the auditors give you this comprehensive annual financial report delivered to you in November, December. So once again, the figures that I'm showing here are going to be in your CAFR from the end of the previous fiscal year. Okay, you have adopted a policy on what is going to be the minimum amount of general fund balance that you have on hand. And right now, your policy says you're going to keep 50% of what the projected expenditures are. So projected expenditures is before you adopt the budget, you have listed how much money you're going to spend. And in this case, it's a little over $12 million. And so by policy, when you adopt a budget, you can't use more, you have to have at least a minimum of 50% of the projected expenditures. Now, there's a state law, however, as well, but that state law is 8% of those projected expenditures, or 8% of the revenues. The reason behind that 8% is the state wants you to keep at least a minimum of 1 month operating on hand. It's not something I would ever recommend for you to keep as a minimum, but is an absolute minimum per the state. So that is your fund balance. Talk a little bit about your tax base. So to tell a story about Zebulon is to tell a story of a tax base that's changing. In 2009, the value of all the commercial and industrial properties within the town of Zebulon totaled about $565 million. The total of all the residential properties within the town of Zebulon totaled about $245 million. So your tax base is 70% commercial industrial, 30% residential. This is very unique. There is no other community in Wake County like you all, and there are a handful of communities throughout the entire state that is like you all. That presents a particular situation related to your economy that you'll need to be aware of when you budget for things about how much general fund balance you may or may not use. Fast forward to 2019, the value is changing, so the commercial is now $809 million, residential is $300 million, so you have a growing residential sector, but you still have a tax base that by and large is 70 to 73% commercial, and a third of that is residential. That's your tax base. In 2009, GSK represented 51% of that total value. So as GSK went, so did the town. Pleased to say that we've got a little bit more diversity within the town, and now as of 2019, GSK represents 31% of the total value. So that is a concerted effort to get some more residential within the town. That's also an example of diversification within the industrial sector, BB&T coming online with their massive data processing center. That's another example of diversification, which didn't put so many eggs in the basket of GSK. Talk a little bit more about your tax base. There's that breakdown between commercial and residential, but there's another story that's going on. Of the tax base, that tax base is broken into three categories. There are funds that are public service funds, there are funds that are personal property taxes, and there are funds that are real property taxes. So what the public service represents is you've got property and buildings within the town that are owned by public utilities, Duke Energy being an example. Okay, they make up a small percentage, but it is one of the units of your tax base. Personal, well, let's talk about real first. Real property tax, that is the value of land and buildings within the town of Zebulon. Personal is the value of vehicles and equipment. Real property tax value in Wake County is calculated every 4 years. Personal property tax value is calculated every single year. And that's important to know as I tell a little bit of story later about your economy. Know that GSK, 26% of their value is tied up in personal, 5% is real. So what that means is they've got a lot of investment in equipment in those buildings over there, much more compared to the value of the land and the buildings that they house that equipment in. So what does this mean as far as your economy? So in 2009, you had about $400 million worth of real property and $400 million worth of personal property. In 2010, the value of the real property increased, while the personal property actually, you'll see when you look at your screens, it's hard to see from this big screen, but the personal property dropped a little bit. And the reason for this is there was a revaluation that occurred in 2009 by Wake County, so the value of properties within the town of Zebulon increased, so that's why real property increased. Fast forward to 2011, real property is staying pretty much the same. Personal property is dropping. 2012, real is dropping a little bit, personal is dropping more. 2013, we actually see an uptick in real. We see a continued decline in personal. And so this is the explanation of Zebulon's economy. What's going on in this picture is there's a few things. The reason real property is staying pretty flat for you all is for 3 reasons. First reason is what I had mentioned about Wake County. They only value the property every now 4 years. Back then it was 8 years. So the property didn't get revalued. When the housing bubble burst and the economy started tanking, there wasn't a tax assessor who came out and said, oh, this property is worth a lot less. So the economic crisis, the meltdown occurred between assessments. So that's one reason that the real property didn't devalue. The other reason it didn't devalue is, relatively speaking, you don't have at least at that time, you didn't have a big tax base that was based upon residential development. A lot of your tax base was based upon equipment of these major manufacturers. And so what were the major manufacturers doing as the economy was tanking? They stopped investing in their operations. So if they had a vehicle, they let it go a little bit longer. If they had a piece of equipment, they let it go a little bit longer. And every time they let that piece of equipment go longer, or they let that vehicle go longer, it devalued because it depreciated. And so the taxes coming from that was less because the value was less. So in Zebulon's economy, when there is a retraction and these industries, they stopped reinvesting in their big plants, it affects you as far as your property tax revenue. 2014, things start to improve a little bit. Companies start to reinvest again. Real property stays flat. Personal is starting to grow. Then 2016, you have some developments come into town. And fast forward by 2019, you've got that breakdown there. And then the last area, by the way, if you all have a question, just raise your hand and I'll pause. The last area that's going to influence how much general fund balance that you have on hand is your tolerance of risk. So we went through the risk compass exercise, and that was in part so you would gain a better appreciation of what your fellow commissioners thought as far as risk. It was a way for you all to work effectively as a group to get to know each other. It's also a tool for you to understand what your level of risk was. It was also a tool to understand when a recommendation comes from staff, what their level of risk was. And so what we found out at retreat is the level of risk by the commissioners as a whole was in this prudent, deliberate area, whereas the staff was a little bit more tolerant of risk in this composed area. So all those things, your tax base, your economy, your personal and collective approach to risk, all influence how much general fund balance you decide to use. So as I mentioned, let me talk to you about two scenarios. One is managed cash flow, and one is how much general fund balance to hold on to. So this is a highlight of that area between 2009 and 2013. You see the property value increase a little bit between 2009 and 2010, and then from 2010 to 2013 it drops. Overlapping that, there were some changes that were made on the property tax rate. So between 2009 and 2010, the property tax rate was dropped. It was kept flat between 2010 and 2012, and then in 2012, it was raised. So here's what the result of that was. Between 2009 and 2010, there was an aggregate amount of revenue that came into the town of Zebulon. It was more than what had come in the previous year. Was it enough to meet the growth in services? I would argue probably not, but the fact remains is that it brought in more revenue than came in the previous year. And the reason for that is even though property taxes were dropped, property value raised enough to make up an aggregate gain. Now, while property tax rate was left flat, the next year there was a loss. So there was a $138,000 loss because property value devalued. 2011 to 2012, there was an additional $149,000 loss. So 138 down from the year before, that 138 stayed down, and then 149 got added to it. And then between 2012 and 2013, there was still a loss, but it wasn't as great a loss because the property tax rate was changed. I'll come back to this slide. This period that staff that went through it, known as do more with less, is something that continues to haunt us from as far as our investment in staff as well as our investment in equipment, but I'll bring up that point later. The reason I bring it up here is this is a scenario that you could use for general fund balance. It's not necessarily a prudent long-term approach, but when you have a situation like this, you really have two options. You either need to cut services, which means send people home, and in some cases, there's only so much you can cut services. Police and fire, for an example, there is a minimum number of officers and firefighters that you have to have on board. So that's one option, is cut service. The other one is to raise taxes. If you don't want to cut services or raise taxes, and you see this as a unique one-year blip, you can use general fund balance to make up the difference. Once again, it's not necessarily something recommended to use your savings account for operational expenses over a long term, but depending upon how you approach risk, that may be an option that you want to consider for managing cash flow. A bigger impact, and this is one that we haven't experienced, thankfully, I'll knock on wood, but is this notion of globalization. So there's your unrestricted fund balance. There's the Great Recession that I just talked about. That was the loss in property tax revenue. But you have industries within your town that have plants throughout the U.S. And if that business decides to, through economies of scale, relocate their business to another facility, then you have lost the personal property tax revenue from that. And so we picked one example of a business that's within your corporate limits that if they left, you would have an additional loss in the personal property tax revenue for that particular year. You also have firms within your corporate limits that are international firms. And similar to the regional model, if they were to collectively try to achieve economies of scale and move a plant from your corporate limits to another city, you would experience a loss from that as well. And so that's an example of one of your international industries if they were to leave town, as well as one regionalizing, as well as experiencing a Great Recession. There again is your policy. So if that was to happen and you wanted to maintain services, by keeping a minimum of your policy on hand, you could probably run for about 2 years before you were out of options. When a company leaves a town, they not only take their property tax revenue with them, but they take their employees with them as well, and their employees can have an impact on your economy. And I share this just so you know the full story of when a company leaves, but also some of you have been really focused on wanting to get more retail activity, and I just want to give you a sense of what it means. So on the sales tax revenue, when a company leaves and employees leave, there's a drop in sales tax revenue. So as an example, GSK, if you look at your CAFR, based in here, they've got 800 employees. I don't know if they've got 800 employees, but that's what the CAFR says. US Food says 560 employees. Let's say, just for the sake of discussion, all of them went to lunch every single day. Now, that wouldn't happen for a couple reasons. They work on shifts, so they're not going to all be working the same shift where you go to lunch. The other thing is GSK, as an example, tries to incentivize their employees to stay on site, and so they have a cafeteria there and they try to offer cheaper meals. But let's just say, for the sake of discussion, all of them came to lunch, went to lunch every single day, averaged $10 a lunch. They would spend close to $5 million in lunch. The sales tax that they would generate, well, an article of the sales tax, the article of sales tax that stays within the county of purchase, known as Article 39, would be close to $50,000. That money gets sent down to the state. The state then gives it to the county, and the counties, plural, have the opportunity to distribute it in one of two ways. One is based upon the value of the tax base of all the communities, or the population of all the communities. So in Zebulon's case, that comes to 0.225%, because relatively speaking, we have a very minor population compared to some of our other municipalities in the western part of the county. So that sales tax comes back to $128. So it gives you a sense of scale of what you're talking about. Now, the positive thing is, same thing happens in downtown Raleigh. Downtown Raleigh has a lot of events. Well, they used to until COVID-19 came along. So the same amount of money spent in Raleigh is coming back to you as well. So the success of other municipalities is your success as well. All right, let's talk about the favorable bond rating. So there are bond rating agencies. Moody's is one, and they have a formula that they follow when they provide what the bond rating is for a municipality. So finances, your financial condition represents 30% of the score. Your economy and tax base represents another 30% of the score. The management of your finances represents 20% of your score, and the amount of debt or the pensions that you are due to pay out is another 20%. In the financial section, that is where fund balance makes its presence known. So 10% of the amount of fund balance that you are carrying as a percent of revenues makes up 10% of that total score. How much fund balance you carry over a 5-year period as a percent of revenues plays into that as well. That represents 5%. And then the cash balances that you have as a percent of revenues, as well as the 5-year change in cash balance as a percent of revenues, makes up the remaining 5% of that 30% section. So how do you all fare? Here's that chart once again. There's the unrestricted fund balance. By policy, you are holding on to that amount. Your revenues. Now, there's a little bit of distinction I want to point out here. Your policy says projected expenditures. Moody's looks at revenues. So here's what the difference is. Your policy looks at how much you are anticipating to spend. So projected expenditures is what you have budgeted to spend in the coming year. Moody's looks at what you actually spent. So your policy is forward-looking on how much you might spend. Moody's comes in and takes a look at how much you actually did spend. So to get the maximum score from fund balance from Moody's, which is a AAA rating, you need to keep that much on board. So you need to have 30% of your revenues. All right, so that's it for general fund balance. I'm going to pause just to see if there's any questions you've got.
But Joe, and I think Beverly was on the board when we decided on those, the floor of 50%, and it wasn't that you couldn't ever go below 50%. You had to do it with special intent.
Right.
So it was never that we would never go down
Okay.
below that. My recall is at the other side that there was a 70% cap on that. Now, I don't know, we'll have to go back and see how it was entered, and if you don't remember that.
I remember us
The
doing
idea
that.
was that anything over 70% would automatically roll back to be used in the budget without any special intent.
Okay.
So, and you could actually use some of the other down to 50, but the idea was not just to keep accumulating cash. It was like, okay, when we hit 70, we're going to quit accumulating. So I want to be sure the board understands that that was the intent with this. And it was, and I know you disagree with me on this, so we're okay, but we went to New York and met with Moody's, and I forget the other one now. You can help me. What's the other rating bureau? Standard & Poor's, yeah. And they really, that was back during the time of the Ball Stadium coming along, and they really queried us about fund balance. They really did. I don't know if they feared we were going to dump it. I don't know what they were thinking, but boy, they did ask it over and over and over. So I know what you showed here. I'm just telling you what my history was. And it was some time ago. Things may have changed. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay. We'll roll into property value and tax. What's the cause and effect of tax rate changes? So once again, this is that highlight of that period that's known as the period of doing more with less, and those are all the changes. So, excuse me. So the mental and the physical effects of this period are still felt within this organization. I'll talk about the physical effects first. You'll see in the budget that we present to you is we've got a lot of backlog in vehicle needs. And we have held on to, because we've had to hold on to vehicles for a very long time, and so it's costing us more in maintenance, and it's also more problematic to get out of the hole. The other thing that happened in this period is we stopped investing in our employees, and so their salaries started to lag behind and get behind the market. And there is still feelings, I know from doing employee surveys, that remembers this as that time where their salaries not only fell behind the market, but also they did not get the staff to help them, and so they started doing more. And so you started seeing more feelings of burnout. So this is a period that's still with us. So even though taxes were kept flat for that 2-year period, it still had an impact on the service delivery that was provided to your citizens. Now, the other side of the coin is whenever you change taxes, you affect your citizens as well on how much they pay. So this is something that I thought might be useful for you just to have an appreciation of what changes in property taxes do to your property owners and what they pay. So on a $100,000 value building, if you change the property tax, if you increase it by 1 cent, that property owner is going to pay $10 more a year in their property tax bill. If the value of their building and property is $300,000, they're going to pay $30 more. If they're a business owner that has a $5 million value building, property, and fleet/equipment, a 1 cent increase is going to result in an annual increase of their property tax bill by $500. So those are general examples. Let's talk about what's going on in Zebulon on the residential front. So the average value of a home in Zebulon, and this is the latest information we've got from Wake County, which is January 1st of this year, it's a little over $190,000. So a 1 cent property tax increase would be $19.12 more a year, whereas the median value home of $176,000, 1 cent tax increase would result in, and that's incorrect. It says $1,271. It should be $1,769.
Right.
Now, for comparison purposes, we shared this information with you at retreat. on average, for the utility bill that your citizens are paying, and we picked 3,100 gallons a month as the average for both Zebulon and Raleigh customers. In Zebulon, or any community that has not paid off their debt, and Zebulon and Wendell are the only two remaining communities the two remaining merger communities that have not paid off their debt. Those residents pay $114 a month, whereas the residents of Raleigh or the merged communities that have paid off their debt are paying $46 a month. So the difference is $68 a month, and over 12 months, that's a difference of $816. So give you just some comparative examples of what rate changes in property tax does versus what rate changes in utility rates do. All right, let me pause again before I go into revenue neutral, because that's going to be a pretty dense subject. Any questions or comments? All right, revenue neutral, it's something that you get to do every 4 years. Revenue neutral tax rate is actually something written into the general statutes. And because it's written into the general statutes and there's a formula within the general statutes, it's clunky and it's got a lot of legalese. So I'll make my point by reading excerpts of it. In each year in which a general reappraisal of real property has been conducted, the budget officer, in council manager forms of government, the budget officer is your town manager, shall include a statement of the revenue neutral property tax rate for the budget. In other words, every 4 years when Wake County computes property values, the town manager includes a statement with the recommended budget. That statement is called a revenue neutral property tax rate. The revenue neutral property tax rate is an assumption that the value of property in town has increased. So think of the tax base value. 2009 was this size. By 2019, it got to be bigger. So there's an assumption there that your tax base is going to grow. That's not always the case, and it wasn't the last time a revaluation was done for Zebulon. But if that's true, what it means is the current tax rate, in your case, that's 59.2 cents per every $100 of value, will bring in more revenue. So if your tax base grows and you keep the tax rate the same, you're going to bring in more revenue. So the revenue neutral tax rate is an attempt to be transparent and just let the taxpayers know that the tax rate that brings in the same revenues is the revenue neutral tax rate. So your tax base pie, so to speak, gets bigger, your tax rate comes down. So think of it as a slice of pie. As the pie gets bigger, the same angle for the pie gives you more slice of a pie. So what's the decreased angle to give you the same slice of pie? That's what revenue neutral property tax rate is. All right, I'm going back to the general statutes to just let you know how problematic and difficult this can be. But the formula is actually written into the general statutes, and I think that's problematic, but here's an example of it. To calculate the revenue neutral rate, determine a rate that would produce revenues equal to those produced for the current fiscal year, then increase the rate by a growth factor equal to the average annual percentage increase in the tax base, and know that the budget officer shall further adjust the rate to account for any annexation, de-annexation, merger, or similar event. So, in other words, here's 3 easy steps to calculate the revenue neutral tax rate. All right, so we're focused on this period when the last valuation was done, which is FY 2017. In FY 2017, if you look at this chart, if you look at the blue line on this chart, the value of the tax base in Zebulon in 2017 was about I'm sorry, I'm on the right one. Yeah, it was $932 million. In 2018, you finally broke the $1 billion barrier, and your value was a little over $1 billion. So the growth between 2017 and 2018 was a 14% increase. In 2019, the value increased by 4% to $1.1 billion. And then in FY 2020, the value was close to $1.2 billion. So the average growth rate between each of the years between 2017 and 2020 was an 8.7 annual average increase. So that's step 1. Step 2 is then to estimate the revenue that you would have received without the revaluation. So what the formula says in the general statute is to figure out the value of your tax base for the coming fiscal year, FY 2021. You take the value that you got in the previous fiscal year, which is this 1.19 billion. You multiply it by this growth factor, which is 8.7, and that's the new valuation. And then what you do is you say, okay, how much money would you have received from that new valuation if there wasn't a revaluation and you kept the same property tax rate? So 59.2 cents per $100 would have brought in $7.68 million, which leads to step 3. What is the revenue neutral tax rate? So take that value that you would have gotten, divide it by what the new valuation is. So the valuation for the town of Zebulon is going to be $1.4 billion. You divide the amount of revenue you would have received by the new valuation, and that's your revenue neutral tax rate. Is there any questions on that?
So that means it would bring in the same from the previous year.
That's right.
What it doesn't mean is that nobody is going to end up paying more taxes, because the reevaluation on a specific building could push it higher or lower depending on, so revenue neutral is a good figure, but it doesn't mean that nobody's going to pay any more taxes. Some will and some will pay less, just simply because of devaluation.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. If you all adopt a revenue neutral rate, there might be the thought among some of your citizens that their property tax rate or property tax bill won't go up, but that's not necessarily true. If their particular piece of property increased in value greater than the average, then they still could pay more in property taxes even though you adopted a revenue neutral rate.
But it would still cut into services and things like that if you did something like that, if you reduced your taxes.
Well, so let's talk about that. So let's talk about the assumptions. Well, the first thing to know about the revenue neutral tax rate is the statement, not the rate, is statutorily required. So I, as your manager, have to present you a statement. I don't have to recommend that statement. You don't have to adopt it, but it has to be stated. The statutory equation assumes that there's going to be growth. And there's a couple of problems with that. The first problem with that is the county has come up and said that you all in the coming year are going to grow by 8.7%. If you are a growing community like you are, you might exceed that growth rate. And if you do, the revenue neutral rate will not provide you a sufficient revenue. So that's one issue with the growth rate. The other issue is it assumes the initial revenue was sufficient. So if you've been running a very lean ship and you have not been producing the revenue, all the revenue neutral rate says is the amount of revenue you brought in last year, apparently you thought it was good, so it's just going to bring you the equivalent of the revenue for the coming year. But if your revenue was not sufficient to provide services to begin with, adopting the revenue neutral rate is just going to put you further behind. And that was a situation that you had when that do more with less. Your property tax value was actually devaluing, and so the revenue that was coming in was not sufficient to provide the services for your citizens. So those are two aspects to growth where if you're not mindful of the growth that you had or the growth that you're coming and you simply adopt the revenue neutral tax rate, you could end up behind in providing revenue that you need to provide services. Even if it is a good growth assumption, even if you are coming out of growth, just know that it's only good for the next year. The following year, the revenue neutral rate needs to be, you need to look at the tax rate every year. It's not going to be something that's going to be good until the next reappraisal. And that's because over time, you lose ground to a consumer price index. The consumer price index relatively recently has been getting quite high, and that's going to influence how much I propose to you all in the budget. But for the last year and the past 4 years, it's been below 2%. So you're probably not going to lose too much ground to a CPI. Where you lose a lot of ground is with the PPI, and the PPI is the Producer Price Index. It's a reflection of what kind of increases you're seeing in materials and commodities. So as an example, a commodity like oil that's used in fuel, that's used in asphalt, it can have an acceleration rate or an inflation rate that far outpaces inflation or the consumer price index. Steel, high demand commodity, that well outpaces the CPI. So just understand that even if the assumptions are good for growth, that if you don't check your tax rate every year, it can eventually lose ground to both the indices for consumer price and producer price. At the end of the day, you need to set the rate that Zebulon needs. You have strategic goals and projects. You have adopted a Zebulon 2030 strategic plan. You have an exceptional tax base. You cannot look at your neighbors. While it will be tempting to look at the tax rate that your neighbors are charging, you have a unique tax base. Not only, there's no one like you in Wake County, there's very few like you in the state. Understand that you have some development trends. You have been a town that has been mostly servicing industry, which has far different service requirements than a residential tax base. And so residential tax base, while we're diversifying and growing, they have more needs than an industrial tax base. So just understand you're going through that change. And as with anything, just understand there's a financial cause and effect. If you increase a tax rate, if you keep the tax rate the same, if you decrease the tax rate, there's always going to be a cause and effect on either the service delivery or the impact of the rate that the property owner pays. Okay, let me pause again. We're coming to the conclusion. Before I get into revenue projections, are there any questions on the revenue neutral tax rate? Okay, revenue projections. We've taken some things that you should be aware of when we present the budget to you next week. That COVID-19 will have some very real impacts on the financial projections. We're expecting a reduction in sales tax revenue. The municipalities within Wake County, we keep an informal poll, and they're taking different varieties based upon the risk about how much reduction they are expecting. The budget we'll put before you is going to be a more conservative approach. We should expect, and this is based upon the guidance from Wake County and their tax collection office, that we should expect to see a reduction in property tax revenue collection rate. So we have a certain percentage. While we have a value that we could collect, we always assume that there's going to be a percent of that actually come in and pay. This year, we're going to have even a more conservative approach to what we think that the collection rate will be based upon guidance from Wake County. We should expect to see a reduction in personal property tax revenue in FY21. This revenue reduction would be associated with the personal property tax for personal vehicles. We're not really expecting to see a decrease for the company personal property tax because they've already been locked in January 1st of this year, so their value already locked in. Your individual citizens with their vehicles, we expect you're going to see them hold on to vehicles longer, and so you'll see some depreciation there. And then the last area we're expecting a reduction is in your parks and recreation fees. Obviously, closing programs is going to reduce the amount of fees, closing the ability to gather, so being able to rent facilities. We're going to see a reduction in fees related to that as well. So those are the reductions. We're also expecting some delays with vehicle renewals. Some grace has been granted to allow people to lag in their renewals, and so that's going to affect this municipality and the amount of personal property tax revenue that comes in. But also, you have, every municipality in Wake County for that matter, has a tag fee. Your tag fee is dedicated to street and thoroughfare improvements. So while it will still be required to be paid, we expect that there will be a delay with that revenue coming in. We also expect there to be a delay in sanitation and recycling fee collections. One of the things that happens is the city of Raleigh when they send out water and sewer bills, they send out the bill for our sanitation and recycling services as well. They are seeing a decline in people paying, and that could be for a whole host of reasons. It could be the fact that people are struggling to pay the bills. It could be a reflection that people are struggling to make the transition to payment online. We've tried to make accommodations for those who don't have the ability to pay online, as an example, having the mailbox out front, and other communities have done the same. So it could be a reflection of that transition. It could also be a reflection that there might be some confusion that, given the restriction to cut off services got implemented by the governor, that there might be some confusion with customers thinking that they don't have to pay the bill. Or maybe they're hiding behind the fact that their water sewer won't get cut off, that they're refusing to pay. For whatever reason, we're seeing a delay. And so when they are not paying their water and sewer bill, that means they're also not paying their sanitation and recycling bill as well. The bill still comes to us from GFI. We're still going to get billed. It's just we're seeing a delay in the fees that Raleigh collects for us on our behalf through the water bill. And then this is not something to worry about in this coming year, but in your next budget, the FY22, if there is that retraction that I showed you in that graph for the businesses not reinvesting in equipment, not investing in vehicles, you'll see it in FY22, because that's when the value, I'm looking at Bobby, the value for that gets determined January 1st of this coming year. Yeah. And it won't be charged until the next fiscal year. So those are things to be on the lookout as far as revenue projections. I think that's the end. I'll pause there to see if there was any questions on revenue projections before I start to wrap up. All right, what's next? Budget will be presented to you on May 20th. You'll have your first work session on June 10th. The topics that we'll bring before you is on community and economic development, on property management. Property management is the buildings and grounds, all of the town-owned and maintained buildings and grounds. The greenways, bicycles, and pedestrian, or what we're calling the walkability group, we've got some projects that we'll bring before you for consideration. Your second work session is on June 17th. We'll talk to you a little bit more detail about the fleet situation that I alluded to, talk to you about some street and intersection and signalization projects that we're going to recommend, as well as some changes to information technology, both in how we provide services as well as security to this campus. With each of those work sessions, we'll have an opportunity for public input. Because we have to operate differently this year, we're still figuring out a way to get the public to participate, but we're still figuring that out. You'll have the budget public hearing on June 22nd. You'll be in a position to adopt the budget ordinance if you so choose that same night. You don't have to, as long as you do it before the end of June. And once again, you can adopt the budget ordinance that's recommended, or you can modify it. So that's your pre-budget review for tonight. I'll take any final questions or comments. As the mayor alluded to with the change of your agenda for tonight, you'll need to, I put down call for a May 20th meeting. Actually, you just have to amend the meeting schedule, and there's some helpful hints in there from Lisa about the motion that the board should consider. But before I turn it over to Lisa for her guidance on that, I'll see if there's any final questions or comments on the pre-budget presentation. Yep.
So when you were talking about the reduction in property tax revenue collection rate that the city of Raleigh's kind of passing down to you, do you have an idea yet of what that percentage is going to be?
That the city of Raleigh is?
Well, I mean, like, is that drop off going to be like a 30% drop in the collection rate, or are we, is it going to be higher? Is it going to, like, do you have a ballpark understanding of what that's looking like?
Yeah, okay, so the reduction in property tax revenue collection rate, I think that's what you're referring to. Mm-hmm. That's guidance we're actually getting from Wake County, from their...
Oh, Wake County.
Yeah, from their tax collector. And the guidance we're getting from them is take another full % off. So Wake County is actually pretty strong on collection rate. Usually it's 99.6%, so it's strong. But we're gonna back off of that based upon their recommendation.
I know we used to be around 97, I think.
Oh.
Yeah. And so it always came in better.
Yep.
But in years past, it was, I think it was 97 is what we actually set it at. I don't know. Do you remember, Bob? Well, this was before your time, but it was, and we always exceeded that. I mean, it made that cushion there, which, of course, contributed to fund balance, too.
Did that answer your question?
It did.
Okay.
And another question, which I'm not sure where it fits in or if it fits in, but with the census that's going on right now, do we have an idea, like, I know that the more people that respond to the census, the more money that we get federally. I feel like that's like even more important now for everyone in Zebulon to be making sure that they have completed that so that we're getting more funds for us to be able to work with.
That's right. So if you recall that part of the presentation where I talked about the sales tax revenue, the reason we get such a paltry amount back is because our population, relatively speaking, is low. And especially as quickly as we're growing, we really need people to respond to that census so we can get the credit for the amount of people that are moving into our community.
Right. Do we have an idea of where we're at with
I
that?
can answer that.
Yeah.
I did a show this past week, as a matter of fact, with the fellow's name was Byron. I forget his last name, but he was head of Wake County I-Count. And we talked about those numbers in there. We're a little over 55% right now. We're actually the lowest in Wake County right now. I think Wendell was around 60%. They were second. And it goes on up to, I think Holly Springs is the highest, and they're pushing 80%, 75 to 80, somewhere along in there. I know that Dick Sears, the mayor of Holly Springs, and John Byrne, the mayor of Fuquay, have a bet as to who can finish the highest count level. But if you'll go look at that show, it'll give you, Byron does a really good job of covering a lot of this information. But the low number figure is about $1,600 a person a year if they're not counted. It costs you that. So that actually, in our range, works out to about $18 million over the 10-year period. But I encourage you to go look at that. We filmed it at the East Wake TV studio, and, you know, I just hope it's really some good, useful information for people to see that. But those are the numbers that I can give you right off the top of my head from that show.
Do we have any guidance from Fuquay or any of these towns that have higher counts? Like, what have they been doing to encourage their residents to respond?
Basically what we just started doing, and we have a lot of lower income that's harder to get. So now we're starting to target Hispanics and other low income, and we're looking at different methodology to go to them, but we have not yet gotten to the door-to-door count. And that's going to add a lot. So a lot of those communities are doing online response where we have people that maybe don't have that capability. I don't know. So I'm not scared yet, but we're working on it, and that's the best I can answer, Shannon.
Okay, no, that's good. Thank you.
Teresa Piner is actually heading that up, and she helped, excuse me, she helped put this TV show together. So again, I think you'll find a lot of useful information if you look at that, and that information is not coming from me, it's coming from the guy I interviewed. So he's the one that had the expertise.
And the town has rolled this out on their site? The town has this interview rolled
I don't
out?
know if they've given you the link over yet, do you know? Okay. Well, we're going to, and I talked to the chamber about it as well. It's also, they set it up at YouTube. You can go to East Wake TV and find it there. But Teresa's going to roll it out, or at least the station will. So
Okay.
it's probably 15, 20 minutes maybe.
Okay.
To add to what the mayor was talking about, we've also done, we are reaching out to Fuquay Arena. Specifically, they were the leaders until I just heard the mayor's report. We're doing some PSAs. One of the things I think is interesting is we're fortunate in having one of our employees, Sam Jarquin, who is bilingual. He did a PSA for us, and it wasn't a week later, we saw a 3% increase in the response rate. So we're learning, and we're doing things on our own as well.
It really has improved because just before COVID, we were like 43%. So now we're up to 50,
55.2, I think it was. Now, this was maybe 4 or 5 days ago, so I imagine it's up more now, but we can get those numbers for you, though. I mean, they're
No, I just
readily
wanted to
available.
have an overall understanding of kind of where we were sitting,
Yeah.
because that's,
Well, we're at the bottom of the pack. But working on it.
And yes,
Yeah, this may be in the proposed budget that you bring to us, but on the water rate, for example, it's $114 per month at $3,100. I'm curious what the impact of the budget would be if we could knock that down to like $80 a month. How bad does that hit our budget on prepaying or reducing what we owe the city of Raleigh? So I know we have, another 18 months or so of payments?
Yeah.
yeah, I think what you're saying is, right now, the payout is scheduled to be January 21. And if we reduce the amount of what our customers are paying, we stretch that out further. Is that what you're saying? Okay. We'll discuss that with Raleigh. Contractually, we're bound to have the rates, it's written into the contract that the rates go up by 5.5% until we get paid out. So we could talk to them about renegotiating the contract and see if we could string it out. The thing that all of us should be aware of, that January 21 date is based on a lot of assumptions. One assumption is that the city of Raleigh keeps their rate the same. If they increase their rate and chips into that, we're on this hamster wheel that we don't get off. The other assumption that it's based upon is that we continue to grow at rates that will get us paid off by January 21. We're not hitting those rates right now, and that's even right before COVID-19. So there's no guarantee that we would have hit January 21. I don't know that they're going to be interested to renegotiate a contract, but that doesn't mean that we can't ask.
Yeah, I'd just like to explore it.
Yep.
but we were talking about selling back,
And we've made that offer,
and they've,
and I've got a response, but I just haven't looked at it yet.
okay, all right.
Interestingly enough, I was in a meeting the other night, and they're trying to give water to Nightdale, because Nightdale has a credit with them, and they're trying to give them water to pay that credit. It's a weird world.
Other questions or comments? Okay, back in December, you adopted a meeting schedule. That meeting schedule has pretty much been blown up. You did not meet, could not have met in April. You're just now starting to meet now, and so we've had to completely readjust your budget meeting schedule as well as your regular meeting schedule. So I'll turn it over to Lisa to walk you through the proposal that's before you and the motion that you'll consider.
What you've got before you is just the changes that would be affected by adopting or amending your meeting schedule. The meeting on May 20 was supposed to be a work session. That would become a regular meeting, so that's why it's crossed out under work session. It has been moved up to your regular meeting list. No change to the June 1st meeting, that's why it's not on the list. Next meeting would be June 10th, which is a work session for budget. Wednesday, June 17th would be a work session for the budget. Monday, June 22nd would be calling for your budget public hearing, and then you could possibly adopt the budget that night. If you chose not to adopt the budget that night, you would have to call for a special meeting to adopt the budget later in the month of June.
Excuse me.
Questions?
Excuse me, Lisa, when you said June 22nd, you mentioned Monday. I don't know if it's a Monday or not, but on the chart here it says Wednesday, so just to clarify whatever that is.
Monday.
On mine, it says Monday. I'm not-
I was referring to this one.
Yep, yep, that one's incorrect. They didn't get that one.
Okay.
That was just for you. I just gave them the schedule, the basic schedule of what was being changed.
Okay. What we need then is a motion again.
I will move to amend the adopted meeting schedule for the Board of Commissioners as recommended by staff.
Second.
Made, second, all in favor? And the motion carries. Okay. All right, folks, that concludes our agenda for the evening. And what I need is a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
We adjourn. Thank you. Let's cut this off.